I'm Dr. Vincent Baker. I direct the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics. I welcome you to our Moral Formation lecture. So I'm very excited about who we have with us, not just because I've known him for about 11 years, but because he is going to help us think through something that is definitely a challenge of moral discernment in an era where we're trying to learn how to think well about a society that's very pluralistic and a society where we're trying to think about how to deal well with the other, especially when we're not exactly doing a great job of discerning this well. And Christians aren't necessarily leading the way on discerning this well, unfortunately. But tonight, I think we have somebody who can help us think through this well, and particularly in relationship to the questions of Muslims. So who's here to help us do this? It's Dr. Matthew Kaemingk, who is, he does a couple of things for Fuller Seminary in Houston. One, he's a dean, and one, he is a professor of theology. I knew him before any of that, back when he was a master's student at Princeton Seminary. And now, Dean Kaemingk. Oh, so delightful, so delightful. So the way it's going to go, he's going to lecture for about 40 minutes. He's going to go right into the Q&A. I'm going to, especially for the purposes of our recording, I'm going to be the roving microphone questions person this evening. So some of you, to date myself, you remember, like there was a guy named Phil Donahue who used to do that on a talk show that, see, you see who's laughing, right? Some of us of a certain age, yes. But that's what I'm going to do, so that way it gets onto the recording. So you raise your hand, I'll find you, and then please make your questions. If you have a lead-in for the questions, okay, please make your lead-in a brief one. So that we, and then if you need to follow up after Matt answers it, then that's great. But let's make sure that we get the question out first, and then we'll keep our conversation going. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Kaemingk.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, an honor to speak with all of you. This talk tonight comes out of a book that I wrote called Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. We've got it right there. Thanks. And in that book, I try and chart a third way for Christians to respond to this intense issue, and I'm going to be talking about a little bit of that book tonight. And I'm very excited to field your questions, so think hard about those as we go along. In my research, one of the decisions that I made was to focus specifically on the debate over Muslim immigration in Europe. And I did that for a number of reasons. First of all, the issue of Muslim immigration is an old one in Europe. They've been having this public debate for 30 years now. It's relatively new and fresh here in the United States. It became particularly intense over the last 2 years when someone was elected president. Muslim immigration in Europe is an extremely complex debate. It involves issues of where minarets can be built, where mosques can be built, what style they can be built in. It has to do with debates over free speech and blasphemy, about the ability of artists to criticize religion. It has to do with laws about what schoolgirls can wear when they go to study. It has to deal with issues of terrorism and security, surveillance, religious freedom. It is an extremely complex argument. It is also an extremely heated argument. And with every single year, the debate and the issue seems to get more and more complex and more heated. And so what I was interested in was, what is a Christian response to this? What resources do I have as a Christian for engaging in this debate? And specifically for engaging in the heatedness of this debate. So I'm interested, first of all, what can we learn from what has happened in Europe over the last 30 years? And how can we think about that here in the United States? Two major European reactions to loud voices in the public square. We can roughly call these the voices of open doors and the voices of high walls. The open doors folks, predictably, argue for a posture of openness, a desire for government aid to Muslim immigrants, to provide them with health care, to provide them with education, welfare, a wide variety of services. These people tend to focus on instituting a sense of what we would call political correctness, essentially making sure that we say the right things, we use the right language, and sort of suppressing language that's not appropriate or difficult. And then they would seek, throughout European discourse, a sort of soft assimilation of Muslim immigrants. How can we gently help Muslim immigrants integrate into our society? How can we slowly, gently, carefully make them more French or more Dutch or more British? How can we gently help them along the way? On the other side of the debate is the high walls folks. These folks tend to frame this issue in terms of security, first and foremost. Muslim immigration is a discussion about security for them. They are a security threat. They also emphasize an intense focus on law and order. So most Muslim immigrants in Europe are in the inner city. There's a lot of crime, and that they create that as sort of the symbol. Muslims represent young, unruly boys in the streets of Paris and London and Amsterdam. So we need an emphasis on law and order. Third, a revival of national culture, a sense of we need to get back to what is truly French or truly German or truly British. And we need to focus on that intensely. And these Muslim immigrants are threatening our sense of national identity. We're losing what it means to be French or Italian or whatever it might be. So we need to get back to the sense of national culture. This is a direct push back against what they would call a multiculturalism, sort of a cultural emptiness, a cosmopolitanism. And then finally, they would focus on a harder assimilation. In the Netherlands, for example, some Muslim immigrants have been forced to watch videos of nude beaches in the Netherlands and gay people kissing, just to get them to sort of assimilate into progressive European values. The idea here is to use the machinery of the state to make them more like us. So a rougher assimilation. But you can see here the similarity in the two voices is both of them see assimilation as the goal. Both of them frame Muslims as a problem to be solved, a question to be answered, a challenge to be overcome. And both of them see the state as the solution. Both of them look to the state to fix this issue, and the issue is these people I don't like. Okay? The goal is to make them like us. We are the goal. We are sort of the end of history. We are civilized. Now, I think it's a nice thing to talk about Europe, just simply to back up from our own national context for a little bit, because when I start saying Republicans and Democrats, everybody gets kind of tight and tense, and, you know, it's okay to make fun of the French here, so it's okay. Is it okay? All right. So what we're going to talk about here later on is how do we move beyond this politics of walls and doors, right? How do we move beyond this? But I can't assume that you all here in this crowd want to move beyond walls and doors. So first of all, I want to tell you a story that kind of demonstrates how the politics of higher walls and open doors are an unsustainable dead end. So I've got to do a little deconstruction first. But my ultimate goal is to bring us beyond these two secular political voices, all right? So to do that, I want to tell you a little story about the Dutch experience with Muslim immigration over the last 50 years, because it carries some very important lessons for us. That story begins after World War II. The Netherlands was a booming economy. They were building retail shops and factories, resourcing in international business, oil and gas. The country was booming like much of Europe in the 1950s. And they needed cheap labor, and they needed it quickly. There were a lot of jobs that the Dutch didn't want to do. So they looked to North Africa and the Middle East for what were called guest workers. They invited these people to come and work in the Netherlands, and they built these segregated neighborhoods for guest workers where they could all sit and live and then go to the factory, work, and then eventually the plan was they would go home. They'd work here, and then they'd go home. They built little schools for their children, who they started to have children that would, schools that were all taught in sort of Moroccan or Turkish to sort of hold on to that identity so that they could smoothly move back into their country. Now you all, of course, you haven't heard this story, but you know what happens. They stay, right? They start to stay. And then the discussion is, well, what do we do? Well, this is during the 1970s and 1980s in the Netherlands, and most people don't know too much about the Netherlands in the United States. It's a small country that's not ours, so we don't really care too much about it in the United States. But what we do know, what do we know about the Netherlands? It's very permissive, right? We know something about marijuana and prostitution and gay marriage. It's a very progressive society. In the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, it really sort of led the progressive revolution and sexual revolution in Europe. Very, very progressive. And so these were people who genuinely wanted to help these Muslim immigrants. So they built schools for them. They provided generous welfare, education, all of these resources for these Muslim immigrants who were living in their country. And yet, all along, the hope was that eventually they would become civilized, secular Dutch progressives, just like them. Because they had gone through this sexual revolution, they had gone through this religious revolution, they had become spiritual instead of religious, right? They had all of these things. The Dutch represented the picture of the future, right? And these Muslims represented the past, a regressive sexuality, a regressive religion, and we're going to help them see the way because we are the future. Well, did it work? No. Many of the Muslim immigrants did not want to convert to this lifestyle. They were not interested. And over time, the Dutch began to lose their patience. The Dutch become frustrated, right? They're not integrating the way they're supposed to. They don't see the light. They don't see how awesome it is to be Dutch. And they get frustrated. And this frustration builds, and what makes it worse is this sort of regime of political correctness holds it down. You're not allowed to speak your frustration in any way, okay? So it becomes like a pressure cooker, right? People are gaining in their frustration, but they're not allowed to speak. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a number of provocateurs arise. One is Theo van Gogh. That name ring a bell? This is the great-grandson, great-grandnephew of Vincent van Gogh. A provocateur, a filmmaker, an artist who really did not like Muslims, really did not like Islam. Made quite a sport of mocking Muslim immigrants. and breaking open this sort of ice shelf of political correctness. And he was brutal, really just an open racist. He makes a film. I'm going to stay off, that's a brutal. He makes a film, a 10-minute short film, to criticize Islam. And in this film, he takes 5 Muslim women who each share a story of the brutality of Muslim men against them, about being abused, about being oppressed by their husbands or raped. And the whole point of the film is to demonstrate the evil of Muslim men and the evil of the Islamic religion. The film itself depicts naked Muslim women with whip marks on their back and on their front, and sacred texts of the Quran on their bodies. Now, if you know anything about how Christians think about their sacred text, you can amp that up for Muslims in the Quran, to have that placed on naked bodies. But the purpose of the film, more than anything, was to direct not simply at Muslims in the Netherlands, but at the Dutch people. Say, these 5 women are crying out to Allah for liberation, crying out to Allah for help, and it doesn't come. There's no help from the faith. And the implicit message of the film is, will you, Dutch citizen, save these Muslim women from Islam? One morning, soon after the film came out, Theo van Gogh got on his bicycle, like a good Dutchman, and rode his bicycle through Amsterdam in the morning. Mohamed Bouazizi, a Muslim immigrant, came up behind him and shot him off of his bicycle in front of 50 Dutch bystanders in the streets of Amsterdam. Van Gogh was able to get up and hobble across the street, and Bouazizi chased after him, shot him multiple more times, stabbed him, and in front of everyone tried to cut off his head. On the streets of Amsterdam lay dead the great-grandnephew of Vincent van Gogh. That pressure cooker, right, broke open. Mosques, Muslim schools were burned around the country. Muslims were harassed in the streets. And a massive political shift, these are fires that took place in different mosques around the country. And a massive political shift took place. And the rise of right-wing nationalism and populism came in what was a very progressive multicultural society. This is Geert Wilders. He's the most prominent of the right-wing nationalists in the Netherlands. I'm not sure what it is about nationalists and tangerine skin, but, but there you go. And so this politics of high walls comes up that denigrates Muslims, frames them as a threat, calls for mosques to be the subject of surveillance, Muslim schools in the Netherlands being subject of surveillance, all kinds of heightened restrictions on refugees and immigrants, discussing bans on hijabs, but a whole list of harsh political responses come in that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier, to the point at which most politicians in the Netherlands would not dare to call themselves proponents of multiculturalism today. And Wilders, his politics of high walls has developed a sort of partnership with extreme Islam where they tend to feed off of one another. So they sort of shout back and forth. And what had been a relatively peaceful society is now quite contentious. Okay, so let's just review a little bit. First of all, before we criticize the politics of open doors and high walls, I want to list just a couple things that they each get right. The open doors folks are absolutely correct that Muslim immigrants are human beings who have rights and dignity, right? All of us as Christians, this is sort of base for us. They're made in the image of God, and Muslim immigrants have rights and dignity, and they are owed that by every single state. Furthermore, those on the high wall side are absolutely correct that Muslim immigration presents very real challenges, and every single state has limits, has certain boundaries that need to be defended, and we cannot ignore that. So they're absolutely right about those two things. However, the proposals, the way in which they lead, is fundamentally unsustainable. So first of all, the open doors policies were intensely naive about the real difficulty of taking Moroccan sheep farmers who live in a 16th, 17th century society and dropping them into metropolitan Amsterdam and expecting it to go fine. Right? There are real challenges with this sort of pluralism. The suppression of critique and debate, enforcing silence, made the issue worse. They were patronizing towards Muslim immigrants. They saw Muslim immigrants purely as people in need of their help, in need of their civilization, in need of their education. These immigrants brought nothing to the table but needs, emptiness. And fundamentally, it was unsustainable. It was inevitable that this would break open. Because one of the things that open doors policies lack is the ability to cultivate amongst a group of citizens a deep and sustainable affection across difference. A sense of patience for one another, the ability to endure a trauma like that murder. Political correctness cannot build within your soul the ability to respond well to that kind of atrocity or 9/11 or anything like that. It doesn't actually build your soul with that kind of sustainable character. Now, the high walls, first of all, the politics of high walls is too late. There's already Muslim immigrants in the Netherlands, right? They're already here in the United States. Simply proposing restrictions doesn't help us positively deal with those who are already here. Second, it is fear-based. So it is based purely upon framing people as a threat. It's very difficult to build a sustainable democracy purely on fear. I'm not sure if we have a historical example of a thriving or sustaining democracy that's based upon fear of a particular group. It's provocative, so it actually feeds the problem it's seeking to solve. When you frame a group as purely a threat, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then finally, once again, it's unsustainable. You cannot build a peaceful or democratic society with these lines of argument. Now, I'm going really, really fast through a very, very complex history and a lot of complex voices. And so think about your questions you have, but also know there's a lot of footnotes in my book that you can look at later. The biggest problem here for Christians, and this is what troubles me as a theologian and as an ethicist, is that in the Netherlands and in Europe, and I would argue here in the United States as well, Christians buy the politics of either high walls and open doors, and they sprinkle their faith on top of it. Christ is not present as the starting point, the origin, the essence, and goal of how they respond to Muslim immigration. By and large, Christians in Europe and in the United States parrot back the politics of high walls and open doors. And Christ does not play an authoritative role in how they think politically about this issue. At best, he's sort of an afterthought. And so a big part of my book is trying to go back and say, what would it look like for Christian ethics to be focused on Christ? It's an audacious claim, but that's my argument. And so I want to start by telling a story. In the nights after that murder, as I said, a number of mosques were being burned. And one night, a Pentecostal pastor in one of the northern provinces got up, and he walked down to this local mosque, and he knocked on that front door there, and he found huddled inside some fearful Muslims. And they weren't too excited to see him at their door. And he looked at them in the eye, and he said, "I'm here to guard your mosque." And he said, "I've called my pastor friends, and we're going to guard every mosque in this province every night until this stops." And they did. 3 months, Christians walked around these mosques, making sure that they were not attacked. Now, of course, as the Christian ethicist, I had to meet this guy. I got to go meet this guy. And he invites me over, and like Dutch people do, coffee, cake. Right? Really great guy. And of course, my first question for him is, why did you do that? Why did you do that? And he told me something that really caught me off guard, because I was expecting something that I think many of you were expecting. He looked me in the eye and he said, "I don't like Muslims. It's a false religion. They worship a false god. They cause trouble in my country. I don't like them. I want them to go home." I was like, "Why did you do this?" He said, "Jesus commands me to love my enemies, and I had to go. I didn't want to." Now, I'll tell you, if he was my friend, if I was his pastor, I would walk him along his reflections on what Islam is. However, what grabs me is that Christ was a disruptive force in how he thought about his Muslim neighbors. And in times of great fear, in times of great trauma and anxiety, human societies, political societies, need an outside force to bring them back together when we ourselves don't have the resources to sustain political community. There's a great little book called Framing the Hijab that outlines all the different ways in which Muslims are framed in European society. They're framed, they're labeled, they're dressed up in ways to control them, to explain them. And there's two basic kinds of frames that we apply to Muslims. First is threat frames. We frame them as a security threat. We frame them as a threat to democracy, as anti-democratic. We frame them as a threat to national identity or national culture. And I might say we also frame them as a threat to Christian culture and Christian identity. We frame them as a threat to women's rights, or to sexual freedom, or to gay and transgender people. But more than that, we also frame them in terms of their needs. These are people who are in need of our education, people who are in need of finances, people who are in need of even just our protection, or they're in need of liberation from their backwards faith, or they're in need of us to empower them. But the key thing is that we do the framing, we do the explaining, we speak for them, we do not listen. And Christians, by and large, accept one or multiples of these frames. They do not frame their Muslim neighbor with the image of Christ. Christ does not function as the lens through which they see their Muslim neighbor. So what would happen as a thought experiment if we did that? In one of my chapters in my books, I do just that. I want to outline just 5 quick frames or snapshots. And these come from different theologians, actually from the Netherlands. So it turns out that Christians in the Netherlands have resources, have real resources for thinking differently about this, if they would look within their own tradition. We have the resources to go a third way. One Dutch theologian named Abraham Kuyper, Brother Vince, big fan, argues that Christ is the king over time and history. And he says that that's actually really important for religious freedom, for thinking about how we deal with other faiths. Because if Christ is king over the future of our nation, we are not. If Christ is king, then Christians are not. And often there is a human desire to control the future of a nation, right? To steer it in your direction, to make sure that things end up the way you want them to end up, to take that steering wheel for yourself. And what Kuyper says is that when you do that, you are taking a throne that is not yours. That as Christians in a diverse political society, we need to recognize that Christ is the king of history, not Christians, not the church. So to frame Christ first and foremost as the king of history over the future of the Netherlands and the future here of America. The second thing he argues is that Christ is not only the king over time and history, but he's also the king over different social spaces in a society. That Christ alone is sovereign over the society's schools and religious institutions and varieties of families and communities. Christ alone, not Christians. And so this goes directly into all of these debates over having surveillance in mosques, right? Or taking control of Muslim schools, or investigating Muslim marriages. For Abraham Kuyper, he would argue that those are sacred spaces that Christ is going to judge, that Christ has the authority over those spaces, not Christians. And for the state to invade those sacred spaces and the state to direct a Muslim family is a violation of Christ's sovereignty over those spaces. That Christ alone judges those things. And so there is a releasing of the grip, the Christian grip on the nation. Now, Kuyper has some very specific exceptions to this in periods of intense abuse and whatnot. But overall, his argument for religious freedom is that Christ is king, not Christians. Another theologian, Klaas Schilder, has a beautiful reflection on the importance of, on the specific story in the Garden of Olives, or the Mount of Olives, where Jesus is about to be arrested, right? And all of those people come in with clubs and swords and torches, and they're going to arrest him. And all the disciples do what? They get ready for aggression, right? They get ready to fight. And what does Jesus do when the fight starts and one of the slaves of the high priest is injured? Right? He bends down, reaches out a vulnerable hand, picks up the ear, and heals the slave. Schilder says that this is a very important window into how God thinks about justice, liberation, and healing in times of chaos, in times of fear, in times of anger and retribution. Here, Christ demonstrates what justice, mercy, and grace look like. It's an extended hand when all the other hands are brought in tight. It's an extended and vulnerable hand of healing and liberation. Now, I think there is a lot of sociological data that would back up a criticism that is a belief that is often made that Muslims are going to take over, that we're going to have Sharia law here in Chicago, and in 20 years, we're going to be the caliphate of America. There's a lot of sociological data that would say that is not happening. However, here we have a moment where Christ is responding. He's being arrested, he's being taken away against his will, and yet he still responds with generosity, vulnerability, and healing. Schilder also has a meditation, 20 pages, meditation on the nakedness of Christ on the cross. He said, it is a profound thing that the first thing God does for humanity when they leave the garden is he clothes them. And the last thing we do to him is we take his clothes away. And there up on that hill, Schilder argues, we imagine that we expose Jesus. But actually what has happened is he has exposed us. He has taken away our clothing, and we have to look at ourselves. And we have to say, we participated in this. We did this. What does that have to do with Muslim immigration? What did I just say? We love to frame Muslims. We love to dress them up, right, as a security threat, as a wide variety of things. But the important thing is we have to dress up Muslims as different from us, as other, as something to be controlled, as something to be fixed. But for Christians who live in the shadow of the cross, live in the shadow of a naked God, we have to look at ourselves and recognize that any violence we see within our Muslim neighbor is also present in us. And therefore, when we engage in political discussion about our Muslim neighbor, we engage with a posture of humility, recognizing that we were there on Calvary's Hill as well. They are not other. They are us. Fifth and finally, a theologian named Hans Boersma, who teaches at Regent College, has this beautiful book on hospitality and the cross, in which he argues that the way in which we see the cross needs to be through the lens of hospitality. The purpose of what's happening there on the cross is the restoration of relationship, not only between us and God, but us and others. That the ultimate end of that cross is that breakfast on the beach with friends, is a table. And what we find in Jesus is not the politics of high walls or open doors, but the politics of a table. And that ultimately is the purpose of a home, right? When you talk about your home, when you think about your home, you're not like, man, you got to see my house, man. It's got awesome walls. It's really good at keeping people out. That's what we love about this house, is the walls, right? Or you should come to my house. The door is always just wide open and just random people are coming in and out and in and out. No, the purpose of a house is what happens when you're inside of it. It's that relationship. It is that meal. It is that discussion across differences. And the politics of high walls and the politics of open doors cannot help us sit at the table with deep, deep difference. It can't help us stay there over a long period of time. And the hospitality that is embodied in Christ and the cross does not paper over difference. It doesn't ignore difference. It doesn't romanticize difference, right? The hospitality of the cross was costly. It was a costly hospitality. It wasn't an easy or sugary hospitality. It recognized the deep difficulty pain and suffering of the world. There we just get these snapshots, these images of an alternative politics, a table politics, a way to live in the deep difference, right here in Chicago, right? The politics of right-wing nationalism or political correctness can't sustain you over a lifetime in a diverse neighborhood. It can't last. We need the thick table politics that Christ offers. I'm just got to wrap this up here with a story. One of my interviews in the Netherlands was with a group of Christian women in the city of Rotterdam, which is a blue-collar town that's particularly racked with racial and religious tension. And some folks had this idea that we needed to do an interfaith dialogue with Muslims. And so they gathered this group of Christian women and said, hey, why don't you do this interfaith dialogue with these Muslim women? And so they kind of shrugged their shoulders and they said, okay, let's give it a shot. It didn't go well. It didn't go well for a number of reasons. First of all, neither group of women really enjoyed talking about theology. Secondly, the Muslim women in particular weren't particularly proficient in Dutch, let alone theological Dutch. But third of all, theology was not what was immediately on their mind. So the conversation quickly started to die out, and people were worried that this experiment would fail and things would get even worse. But in one of their conversations, one of the Christian women noticed that one of the Muslim women liked to sew. And so they invited her to come and sew with them. And over time, they started to sew together. Now, the nice thing about sewing, I'm told, I don't sew, is that if you don't have anything to talk about, you can just kind of put your head down and focus, right? Or if there's you don't know the answer to a question, you've got something else to do, or you can blow 20 minutes just talking about this pillow, whatever. It's just nice. You've got something to do with your hands. Well, over time, they're sewing together. They start to talk about each other's kids. They talk about their kids. They talk about their husbands. And then they start to just talk about Dutch society. And they start to say, man, I don't like it how materialistic Dutch society is. I don't like the way Dutch society pictures women. They're like, yeah, I don't either. And you see, one of the things for Muslim immigrants is they see consumerism, rampant sexual stuff, all this stuff, they see that as Christian. They start to build this understanding, oh, we have some things in common here. When one of them gets sick, they make meals for each other, they visit each other. They start to build relationships. Not just talking about dogmatic theology, but actually sharing lives, practicing hospitality. And in interviewing the women, the Christian women, I asked them once again, what are you doing here? Why are you doing this? And they used the parable of the sower. They said, Christ is the one who sows seeds. It's my job to remove some stones from the garden. I'm not here to save them. I'm here to demonstrate a hospitality that I have received. And what I would tell you, and what I'm trying to tell many, is that my hope for the church in America and the church in Europe is that we reframe this issue of Muslim immigration, not as a crisis to be solved, not as a challenge to be overcome, but as a profound opportunity to remember the hospitality that we have been shown and to practice it with others. Because if we do not practice that hospitality, then we are spitting on the cross that made space for us, that showed hospitality to us. This is an opportunity for Christian renewal in the United States. It's profoundly fascinating to find churches in Europe that were near death, very old, very white, that have been renewed through the conversion of immigrants or the influx of Christian immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. It's been a profound moment of renewal for the church in Europe and an opportunity to remember the hospitality that we've been shown. Oh, I got one more thing here. A church in London wanted to demonstrate the importance of Christmas and the relevance of Christmas for today. And they asked an artist to help them. And they said, look, Jesus was a refugee. Jesus was on the run. The world said, we have no room for you. And right now we're saying we have no room for these Syrian refugees. Can you help us? The artist went down and collected all of this clothing from Syrian refugees from the shores of Greece and suspended children's pajamas and pants and blouses, suspended them all above the congregation for their Christmas worship service. Now, can you imagine singing a song like, "They will know we are Christians by our love," with that hanging over your head? If we're thinking about Christian formation and moral formation here, theology lectures have limits to how much they can form you. But here in these two things, worship and the practice of hospitality over sowing, there's a formation that can happen. There's something that artists and worship leaders and sowers can demonstrate and inhabit and practice, is that kind of deep and sustaining hospitality that Christians need in this age of fear. Thank you all.
Thanks, Matt. So I will take your question. So just raise your hand. I'll walk to you. Direct your question to Matt.
Yes. Hustle, Vince.
How Christian is Holland now? Is it
It's not.
so terribly secular?
No, about 10% of the population goes to church. About the same amount goes to mosque. No. Yeah. In some cities, more people go to mosque than church. Yeah.
One other thing about that. So in the Netherlands, right, so you and I both know this, that
Yeah.
so you had the phenomenon of pillarization, where you have schools, hospitals, et cetera,
Yeah.
that are, we would say, according to a particular worldview, right? So was part of the openness strategy to create what we would call a fourth pillar. If you had sort of a secular pillar, a Protestant pillar, right, a Roman Catholic pillar, and then a Muslim pillar, right? So,
Yeah.
No. Was that part of that? Okay.
No. The desire was not to create a Muslim subculture in the Netherlands. The desire was to assimilate them into Dutch secular liberalism. That was the desire.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that was the ultimate goal. Other questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
All right, hold on.
Let's keep going.
How do you take this practice of hospitality that sort of breaks down this dividing wall and make it something big enough to actually impact change here and now on a national level for these different places?
Yeah. Thank you. Great question. I would say, first of all, I'm really an advocate of small change first, because it's something we can all do immediately rather than kind of long for. But also we learn really important things through those micro practices and meals, and that shapes our political responses in really important ways. And democratic cultures depend upon sewing groups and soccer teams and clubs And these small acts of hospitality, these build up a critical framework for democratic culture. It depends on it. What's really dangerous is when we all become really isolated and we all engage in our own little social media spheres and we engage in our specific cable news. When we become isolated, that's when the tribalism grows. And so the most important political response we have right now is actually demonstrating that hospitality across those lines. So if you're a Democrat, having meals with Trump voters is really going to be important for you. And if you're a Republican, hanging out with some Green Party folks wouldn't be so bad. And that's critically important. And that's really what the church has control over right now. So I would argue much more for those micro practices. While I would love our national leaders to embody the hospitality of Christ and to think that that's something they should share with others, they don't right now. So, yes. Oh, and I would share one more thing with you. If you do want this national action, I would point you to the work of World Relief, they are doing incredible, absolutely incredible work in terms of advocacy. They have a long history of resettling refugees, but as the refugee numbers have been lowered, they've had to do more political advocacy. Are there World Relief folks in the crowd here? You can raise your hand. There we go. World Relief, thank you. Go talk to them. They're awesome.
So would you say if given the option, Muslim refugees would desire to assimilate more into culture? Because if they would desire to stay in their own communities, wouldn't that make hospitality more difficult?
Can you say that one more time for me?
Yeah, so like just Muslims when they come into the country, they have a tendency to group together and to towns like Dearborn or whatever. Wouldn't that make it more difficult to be hospitable if they're naturally, or if they desire to be more secluded and away from society? Or do you say if given the option and we were actually open to it, they would want to engage with broader society more?
Yeah, okay, so a couple of things. One is Islam is a global religion that is extremely diverse, and so Muslim immigrants react in a wide variety of ways to immigration. So some of them very quickly integrate, some of them don't, some of them do something else. And so Muslims don't do just one thing when they immigrate. But also different national cultures create different responses. So Muslims in the United States integrate relatively extremely well here. Compared to, say, France, where they tend to circle up. And there's very real reasons why that happens, because French society is particularly aggressive and intense in their criticism of Islam and in their demonizing of Islam. So it's quite natural for those communities to circle the wagons. The other thing is that America does not offer much in terms of government help for immigrants. So Muslims who come here tend to quickly get jobs because they need them. And they're also far more educated when they come here. So Muslims make more than most of us in the United States. They make a lot of money, as compared to in France, where they're quite poor for a variety of reasons. So, yes. So obviously, if they're all circled up, it's hard to demonstrate hospitality to them. So you actually need to go to them. Yeah.
Okay, so I just raised my hand because I work for World Relief, so I very much do care about being hospitable to people, and that's a big part of my job. I also do care about being able to critique ideas and balancing that with critiquing the idea and also loving the person. And there's some things in Europe, I don't know if you're familiar with the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Yeah, just recently saying that it's a criminal offense to just insult the Prophet Muhammad. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't want to do that to anyone, but I feel like that would stop people from being able to just think about ideas and critique ideas. So how do we best balance those two? Because I think they're both really important.
Yeah.
So.
Well, one of the challenges here is that we look for political solutions to cultural problems. And hate can't really be completely solved with a political ban on hate. Like, I'm just going to make up this rule that we can't hate anymore. And so it's a real problem in Europe specifically. Having left the Christian faith, Europe is struggling for language for civic virtues of how we treat one another. So for centuries, Europe would draw upon the Christian faith to talk about how we deal and how we live as citizens. But without that sort of moral language or moral framework, they're trying to find things. And much of it is in terms of bans. So if we just make a rule against blasphemy, that will help. The assumption is that that will help Muslim-European relations. But I'm not convinced that that's going to help the situation. Yeah, so thank you. Yes.
Hi, I was wondering how, like, if you know the statistics between Muslims, refugees in European countries and in America compared to like the Eastern Hemisphere, because there's a lot of talks regarding like Muslims coming into Korea as well.
Yep.
And I'm Korean, as you can tell. And they're having a lot of talks, but it's quite, the way they talk about it is a lot more peaceful than like European countries and the States.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, statistics-wise, how, like, what's the difference and why is there a difference? And like, you know, those type of, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
If you know.
No, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but I do know that the United States, the numbers have been dropping over the past few years very dramatically and are much lower than, say, a country like Germany has brought in hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Each of the countries in Europe all have different reasons and different rates. But it's a massive debate within the European Union about these issues, and it's one of the big reasons why the United Kingdom left Europe. It's because they wanted more control over immigration issues. But really, it's a cultural issue, not a political one. It has to do with the capacity of a specific country to respond. And so one of the big reasons why Germany let so many in was they have a cultural memory of guilt about the Holocaust and a real desire to redeem themselves. And so they let many, many in. Now, the interesting thing here, and this is why prudence is important, is there were consequences for that decision. So when Germany let in 600,000 Syrian refugees, there was a backlash. And the right-wing party, the AfD, grew exponentially, and now there's a hard right-wing party in parliament, that's making big waves. So every single action has reaction. And so cultivating a political culture of hospitality is a massive challenge in both Europe and the United States.
Hi, I really enjoyed your slides and the points that you made, so just wanted to start with that. But I have two questions. Yeah. One is about the Christian pastor who went to the mosque and
yes.
said that they would protect it, and
yeah.
he had fellow Christian pastors do the same thing. Can you just tell us if there were threats made in that period, like, and how they actually protected those mosques?
No, there were no threats. So once they were guarded, it was kind of hands off. They were safe.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then the second one is about in the United States. How can you explain, dare I say, the hypocrisy of Christian leaders in this country speaking against refugees and Muslims and immigrants very loudly, how do they rationalize that? How do they do that? And how might that change?
Yeah. It's a complex question, but I would say that in a political culture that continues to polarize, we tend to sort of ramp up the insanity on both sides. Like, as you shout back and forth, you move further and further from reason. But I think a big issue, honestly, is just discipleship and spiritual development of being, our churches are just spiritually weak and biblically thin and theologically dense. And so that makes it really difficult to have a thoughtful Christian voice in the public square because our churches are very thin. We're just not discipling people. And so people are very politically movable based upon emotion. So we don't have spiritual roots. So remember how I talked in the Netherlands about this massive shift that happened from the left to the right? And it happened really quickly. I think political scientists were shocked by how quickly it happened. It was because the roots were so thin that you could move a population with a traumatic event or a charismatic leader. Our churches just are not sturdy in that way.
And one thing I would add to that is that actually in the United States, we have a history of fearing the other.
Yeah.
So not that I'm just
Yep.
planning to advertise other books while you're here, but my friend who's the chair of history at Messiah College, named John Fia.
Yeah.
Just read his chapter about a brief history of fear in America in his book called Believe Me, which is trying to understand the current moment. But, I mean, you'll see that whether it's Native Americans, whether it's Catholics, pre-Vatican II, I mean, the fear of Catholics for Protestants is pretty common.
Yeah, there's interesting studies on Christian apocalyptic literature specifically. So for many years it was the communists that represented sort of the Antichrist. And then in that shift in 1990, suddenly the Antichrist is coming from Muslims.
Yeah.
From the Middle East. I wanted to mention one thing I forgot, just a couple of notes for students in here on how to get started. World Relief, as I said, once again, World Relief people, raise your hands. Go talk to them. They're just amazing people doing wonderful work. I also wanted to mention the Center for Public Justice, where I'm a fellow. This is a really interesting Christian organization that fights for the religious freedom of all faiths. They are a distinctly orthodox Christian organization that believes that Christians should not simply defend themselves, but others. Now, it is a good thing to defend your own religious freedom, but my friends, it is a grace thing to defend the religious freedom of others. And for college students who like to write about politics and justice issues, they have a blog specifically for college students who want to write on justice issues. So if you're looking to develop your political voice, this is a great blog, and they're always looking for undergrads who want to write on justice issues. They're really phenomenal. You can do Islamic studies, Fuller Theological Seminary, woo, and practice hospitality. Practice it. And what practice means is that you're going to be terrible at it at the beginning, and just embrace how terrible you are at it, and understand that, like the piano, we have to start from the beginning.
I also really appreciated what you had to say, so thank you. And your middle ground Christian position. I do wonder, though, about I'm sure you weren't kind of saying that Christians should live in a silo and practice hospitality, but the two extremes that you talked about are political stances, and we do, at the end of the day, live in political societies.
Yes.
So we have to, in my opinion, the responsible thing is to, at some level, engage in politics. Yes. So I don't want to ask you to pick a side, but how would you say that should inform, especially with elections coming up very soon, how should that inform our political engagement?
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for pushing on me. You're just going to make me uncomfortable. So here's the thing. I'm an ordained pastor. And I have very specific ideas about how pastors should talk about politics. And I think that it's very lazy for a pastor to tell you how to vote or how specifically to think about a specific issue. I think that it's my job as a pastor and as a theologian to provide you with some theological frameworks that are going to make you uncomfortable, that you have to wrestle with, and that you have to take responsibility for. It's the responsibility of the church to mess with you. It should not be a politically safe space. It should disrupt you, but not in a lazy way of here's a declaration from this church on here's all the ways in which you should vote, but actually saying you have an important responsibility coming up. And you've got to think about this. And those 5 images of Christ that we talked about, those should haunt us. Like, I'm responsible for following that guy, right? I'm responsible for that. And I'm responsible for honoring that guy when I go to vote. And for honoring my neighbor by living that way. And so as a theologian, I think my important responsibility in this, and it's a finite responsibility, is to provide that framework, and it's your responsibility to think about it. Is that okay? All right.
Hi, I just had a question, kind of how this entire conversation has been framed has mainly been in terms of like Muslim immigration.
Yes.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the benefit as framing it as this kind of more monolithic form of immigration as opposed to trying to integrate some nuance into the conversation. So talking about, say, Syrian refugees or Syrian immigration or immigration from specific communities, as opposed to talking more big picture about a specific religious aspect.
Yeah. Well, when I started this project, I wanted to talk about religious freedom, and I wanted to talk about the ethics of difference. And I wanted to make it really hard on myself. So I wanted to pick an issue that was really complex and really heightened and intense. And so I wanted to think about how we deal with difference just in general, but specifically to say, if it can't handle this issue, then it's not good enough. So that was my thinking specifically in this. And so you're wanting...
I think my thought process was more along the lines of, so kind of, I'm a psychology student.
Yeah.
I think about psychology a lot. So like the kind of intergroup contact that is exemplified in the sewing group is kind of this intergroup contact where you're able to better kind of understand or gain a better conceptualization of what the individual person's culture looks like.
Yeah.
And I also think that language really, really matters in how we talk about issues and how we present them and what sort of language that's used in broader body politic. So by framing it as kind of a Muslim immigration issue, we try to create a mega group of the other.
Right.
Whereas trying to break it down, it's like, no, it isn't just one massive group
Right.
showing up on shores. It's
Yeah.
people from specific cultures to specific.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so context and difference matters. And I think you're absolutely right. That's just a danger of the way that I framed it, that you sort of like, Muslims are this imaginary thing that are monolithic. And that's a dangerous thing. So the important thing for us to do is to develop this posture of hospitality. Like a good host will listen and ask questions and want to hear the story. And I'll respond to you with a story. An eager church planter, and let's face it, church planters are just eager. Eager church planter wants to go into this very diverse neighborhood in Amsterdam and start a church. And he has this exciting idea. I'm going to make meals for them, and they're going to come to my meals, and then they're going to come to my church, and it's going to be awesome. Nobody comes to his meals. He gets frustrated, and he gets down, starting to feel like, oh, I'm a failure, I'm a bad church planter. And dejected, he walks down the hallway of his apartment building and asks this, I think it was a Somali woman, hey, would you make a meal for me? And she brightens up, and she says, come in, come in, come in. Of course, Somali culture just loves hosting. She didn't want to be a guest, she wanted to be a host. He goes in, she makes this amazing meal for him, right? She tells him about her mother and her grandmother and how they taught her how to cook this meal. And suddenly he recognizes, right? These people are tired of being treated like passive patients, right? Problems to be solved, empty cups to be filled. They have a story. And so he says, my job is to help them tell their story. There's no place where they can tell their story because this society sees them purely as a problem to be solved, right? And so he starts to invite them over to his house to make meals. And they start to make meals for one another. And so you have someone from Morocco and someone from Afghanistan and someone from Suriname. And they're cooking and they're sharing their stories. They're talking about their family. They're sharing their culture. And he's developing in a very divided, poor, nasty place, like this space in which they can be human. And he's in the posture of a guest rather than the host who has that power. And they're able to be very unique people rather than Muslims, right? This sort of grand thing. So thank you. That's a great question.
Hi, okay, so I found this lecture to be very insightful, but I guess the question for you I have is, how has this impacted your actions beyond just maybe from a voting perspective?
Yeah. Well, I'll just start this last week. So my wife and I, we've got an 8-year-old, and that means that we do play dates. That's a thing. And so our 8-year-old invited over his buddy Evan, and his parents came along, and it turns out, this was a couple days ago, that their family is Jewish. And well, this has been a big week, a hard week for the Jewish community. And so what that looked like for us this week was giving them time just to share how they were processing that time, and listening to them talk about their fears about going back to their synagogue, and their child's in Hebrew school, and they're scared to leave their kid there. So just being a listening ear is first, and then shock of all shocks, we said, we would love you to come over at Hanukkah to teach our kids about Hanukkah. And they were surprised by that. But it's an opportunity for our children to learn about Jewish culture. And so I think putting yourself in the posture of being a learner and asking questions and having a curiosity is a great start. So it might not be Muslims for you. It might be some other kind of difference, but yeah.
Yeah, my question is on Jesus and the apostles. Even though they were loving and going out to other people, their goal was to talk about the kingdom of God, repent and such. I mean, they weren't just
they were
loving;
preachers.
they were
evangelism.
preaching.
Yeah.
My question is, where does this, middle way leave the Christian evangelist who worry about souls as the loving part of everything?
Excellent question. This is such a huge help for missionaries. Because if you want to convince people that Jesus is hospitable, it's a good thing to start by being hospitable. Like if you want people to say, I want to be a part of that story, you have to live that story. So if you have the posture of fear or fighting, and then you invite people into a story of hospitality, it doesn't work. I gave a similar talk at a missionary society, and they were just saying, yes, yes, yes. The hardest thing for us in terms of evangelism in these other countries is people think of Christians as mean and fearful and angry, and it makes it really hard to share the love of Jesus because you can't be a person of hate and preach a story of love and have anyone think that that's of any kind of value. It just lands flat. So, yeah, there you go.
Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed how you framed it, and really good use of slides, by the way. Because
So the first time I gave a lecture, my buddy who's in marketing, he said, "Oh, professor, those slides are terrible. Let me fix them for you because I'm just a disaster." He fixed them.
yeah,
so
people use too much
that's
text.
for Ryan. Go ahead.
I agree with I think your position about hospitality as an essential Christian ethos, which is necessary. But I'm wondering, in this particular climate that we're living in,
Yep.
not just generally politically, but particularly where you have something along the lines of evangelicals who are something like 80% of evangelicals support this present administration.
Yeah.
Particularly an administration that has a very hostile and aggressive policy on immigration. And something like, according to Pew, if you look at all the different American religions, the evangelical segment tends to be the most anti-Muslim.
Yep.
In that environment, is it really enough to simply promote hospitality as opposed to a more vibrant participation in the political process?
Yeah. Thank you very much. If I've come off as too nice and not prophetic, I would say I'm trying to woo people to this position rather than shout at them. And I feel like our political culture has enough shouting, and I tend not to get my point across when I shout. But I think that if it would help, I would love to be a more prophetic in my criticism. It's also just not my personality, but I think it's entirely appropriate at this moment for people to be angry. I think anger, lament, confession is called for. Confession especially of who we have become and what we've supported is an important thing. And lament as to what's happening in the church. So, yeah. But the hope is that God doesn't need us to do his work. God's going to do his work. And so we're not dependent on any political party or church to fulfill that, but God will do what God will do. So, yeah, thank you for your question, though. I appreciate that. I think lament and anger are called for.
And in terms of the political process, did you have a follow-up question? Okay, all right, so I'll go. You had a question? Yes? Okay. So wait, you've got one too? Okay, here since you're right here. Just remember that in the last election, 40% of the electorate didn't vote, right? And so with all the talk about the midterms and everything, yeah. I think that, it's like people can talk about it all they want and then never go to the polls or vote early or whatever. So I think that's another dimension of it, right? Is that you have close to half the electorate actually not participating. So, and I'm sure Christians are part of that.
Yeah.
The not voting crowd.
Thank you, Dr. Kaming. And I just have a quick question. So you gave a couple of examples of hospitality shown by different people throughout your speech tonight. So one by the Dutch pastor to you with the cake and with the coffee. Also with the Somali woman and the pastor as well. So given that right now we're dealing with a lot of Syrian refugees, a lot of Iraqi refugees, what are some salient areas that they look at for hospitality?
I'm wondering if one of our World Relief friends would like to answer that question. Syrian refugees and hospitality. What do you think, guys? Yeah, come on now. There we go.
My first comment, not to disappoint, but I would just say we actually, yes, there are some Syrians in the area who have been resettled by World Relief. But honestly, there are very few compared to other communities that have been being resettled here for years and that are continuing to come. And so if as you're thinking about engaging with refugee communities in the area, that's not necessarily going to be the largest people group you're going to encounter.
Yeah. We're just not letting them in, so there's not many of them
yes.
here.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. As far as so your question was what they're looking for, what types of expression of hospitality would be? Yeah, I mean, I think Ruth and Emily, help me out if you think of things, but I think in a lot of ways the best place to start is just with what is a natural human extension of hospitality. And yeah, and then that combined posture of welcome and of listening, so that you're kind of continuously going back and forth between those, in the sense of extending what you know to extend, and then listening for what indications you receive of how to adjust that.
Yeah, I mean, being able to move back and forth between guest and host, like putting yourself in the posture of, I don't know. And actually, you ask them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Vince, behind you. So there you go.
I work with Exodus World Service in Chicagoland. We are an organization that mobilizes the Christian community to welcome refugees. As a Wheaton alum and someone who works with refugees in the area, I would add to the answer here, and also the practical question over here about how you've shown hospitality. And this is a controversial challenge, but I'll offer it nevertheless. I would challenge Christians to send their kids to public school, because that's mostly where you're going to find these kids who have parents, and you become friends, and then you're not artificially looking for people to invite over to dinner. It's just getting to know your neighbors.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of ways to school your kids, but that's a challenge.
Oh man, yeah. My kiddo's got, his best buddies are from Pakistan and Iran and India. Arush and Ahmad, and good stuff. That's in Houston, friends.
Thanks so much for your talk. This might be like another even conversation topic, but like the idea of the topic of Mexican immigration, and particularly those who are here already and have come here illegally. Like how we can approach that with that hospitable table mindset, but also be respectful of the law when technically they've broken it, and we're trying to find like this medium between being like lawful citizens, but also being hospitable.
As I said to the young lady over here, I think that's a discernment for you of what you feel is disrespectful of the law or not in terms of your conscience, and what you think it means to be a good citizen. And if you think it would be good for all citizens not to speak, talk, invite, or have a relationship with anyone they suspect as being illegal, that would have quite an effect on our American society if that happened. I don't think it'd be a good one. So I'll leave it to you to think about.
So I do have a quick question, but before I answer the question, in response to the question about the Syrian refugees and people from that part of the country, I'm from Northern Virginia, about 10 minutes outside of DC, and there's quite a big Syrian community. And so, speaking from personal experience, we met through a friend at the church. We met a family of Syrian family, and through them we met more Syrians. And some of my closest friends are now those people. And what really broke the ice was, first of all, sharing tea. They love their tea. So sitting down and having a cup of tea with them, having a conversation really about anything. They have a tremendous amount of respect for people who are willing to engage their culture and who have questions about their culture. And something that our church did, we invited these families over for Thanksgiving dinner, because they'd never had Thanksgiving before. And we were going around, kind of our family, my dad's the pastor at the church, and so one of our traditions is to go around and say things we're thankful for. And the members of the church, we did that, and we got to the Syrians. And something that one of them said, he said, I am thankful to have white people who call me their friend. And so for them, they see a disconnect between the Americans and people from the Middle East. They don't think there's this gap that they actually, I think many of them do want to bridge, but a lot of Americans aren't willing to bridge that gap. And so I think simply showing them that the West cares about their plight was really impactful in that relationship. So that is the basic, I mean, it's the hospitable answer, but that's just from my personal experience.
Yeah. So I live in the suburbs of Houston, very diverse neighborhood with suburbs, and we had a house party for all of our neighbors when we moved there because we wanted to meet people and we were lonely. And we brought some people together, and I like making pie, and I'm pretty good at making pie, pretty good at it. So I wanted to show off. But two neighbors came. They live right across the street from one another, and we discovered that they had lived across the street from one another for 15 years and had never met. And so what I say we need to practice hospitality is because we're terrible at it, many of us. Many Americans have become so wealthy and so insulated and so buffered and so deeply, deeply fragmented and lonely that immigration offers us an opportunity to relearn what it means to be human again, to actually open our doors to any kind of difference. I mean, these are just like white folks and they were scared of each other, right? They weren't talking to each other. So like, it's a profound opportunity to learn that basic human practice of hospitality. Yeah?
Yeah, 2 more questions.
Okay, 2 more. These are great questions, thank you.
Hi.
Yeah.
Mine is, I guess, more of a comment,
right.
or 2 quick comments. I love pie. So
Yeah.
next time you come, you could think about maybe.
You got it.
Also, the slides, I'm glad that was brought up. My husband is a visual artist, and so I hear all this talk of bad design and good design,
Yeah.
and well done on those. Also, the inclusion of that piece at the end at the church in London with
Yeah.
the clothing,
Yeah.
I absolutely loved. But the real comment that made me raise my hand is in thinking of hospitality, really locally. I live in Wheaton, and I'm a student here now. And thinking of hospitality here, the 2 things that come to my mind, one is after the immigration ban that this administration put into effect, the local mosque up on Geneva and President opened their doors, and several churches and groups from Wheaton College went. And we went to them, but they opened their doors to us, and they welcomed us.
Yeah.
And we asked about their experience in America, in Wheaton. They shared with us. We took our children, and it was beautiful. And I feel like they did that for us. They welcomed us.
Yeah.
And the second thing is there's a Turkish community center within walking distance of campus.
Yeah.
They, I think, again, it was their initiative, they invited my congregation, which is a Mennonite church, to break the Ramadan fast one evening with them.
Mm-hmm.
They initiated it, but they came to our fellowship hall, and we decorated it with stars and moons. And again, our children played with their children. I hate to say their, because that brings in the word other. But the Turkish Community Center is so close, and they have cooking classes open to the public once a month, and they have all these other programs. So my comment really is to say, if you feel like the other is so far away from you, they are not.
Yeah.
And you can be in relationship.
Yeah. There's a professor, thank you for that. There's a professor by the name of Mona Siddiqui. She's an Islamicist at University of Edinburgh, and she wrote a book on Islam and hospitality, exploring the resources that Muslims have within their history and their tradition in the Quran of hospitality, and of course, Arabian culture as well. And it's profound, and so her and I had this really fun dialogue about what Christian resources there were for hospitality and Muslim resources, and yeah. So, all right, last question.
I was just thinking something kind of unfortunate that we don't talk a lot about is just how this political extremism filters down to children, particularly like in school contexts and kids just kind of repeating what they hear. So I guess I was just wondering, how do you talk to your son about that? How do you teach him? How do you encourage him as he's interacting with people who are different than him?
Yeah. Well, I hope I'm doing a good job. It really is those simple things of Jesus has loved you, and he loves you so much. And the only thing he asks of you is that you love others the way he loves you. So it's just really important that we share that love, that we don't hold it. And so when you go to school, you're supposed to share that with other people, and it gets bigger as you share it. So I guess that's how I talk to him about it. That at Christmas time, we said to Jesus, we don't have room for you, and yet he made room for us. And so we can't say that to others because Jesus is out there, right? And we want to. And he's out there amongst your friends, and so you want to be hospitable to Jesus. So stuff like that. So yeah, all right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
And I promise I'm not saying this because we're friends, but this is definitely one of our best moral formation lectures.
Oh, good.
So thank you very much and also for. It really is. I really like the slides. It almost makes me think about using slides when I do presentations, but nobody should wait for that, actually.